consistent. I want to thank those of you who've been consistent in joining us and following the series. And for those of you who will see this later, we have a really key figure in not just the Detroit landscape, but throughout Michigan, and what he's doing around food and food security. He is Malik Yakini within the community. We call him Baba as a sign of respect, Baba Malik. But he's eternally youthful. He's a musician. He's so much more. And you read the description about him and what he's doing with the Detroit Black Food Network, but his impact is larger than that. He started, African-centered education in Detroit before anybody. He has influenced so many people, including our last speaker, Dwan Dandridge, to do what they're doing now. And he's very humble, so he's not going to say these things about himself, but I need to say it. And with that said, I just want to welcome Baba Malik Yakini to our Fireside Chat.
Thank you, Brother Ellison. It's always a pleasure. And of course, whenever you ask me to do something, the answer is always yes, because I have great respect for you as well. I do want to make one correction, and that is I did not start African-centered education in Detroit before anybody else. There's
my apologies.
My elder, now ancestor, Mama Imani Humphrey, and many others who worked to start the Alexander Crummell School as early as 1975. So I just want to big up those elders and ancestors.
I'm sorry, that's a grave error on my part. You're absolutely right. I guess in the way that you formalize it with the Insta-Roma Institute is what I was looking at. So thank you for that correction. And you're right, we always have to recognize the ancestors. So with that said, we're going to jump right in with these questions. They're pretty straightforward. And we start with, what do you do? But I'm going to back up. We have your bio, but I like to let people say who they are to the people. So if you can first just tell us who you are, and then we'll get into what you do.
I'll start by saying that I'm a spiritual being who is manifested in this body as a person of African descent. And so I move through life with this awareness that I am primarily a spiritual being, as some people like to say, having a human experience. So I think that's important for people to know, because the motivation for much of my work is rooted in my understanding of spirituality and how one advances spiritually. So in a sense, the work I do is in a sense my ministry, you could say that, if we can take a term from the kind of popular nomenclature. So there's a connection between my spiritual development and the work that I'm doing on the physical plane. In terms of the specific work that I do, since 2010, I have been the executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, an organization that I co-founded along with several other people. And we operate one of Detroit's largest farms, D-Town Farm, where we grow more than 36 different fruits, vegetables, and herbs each year. And I'll go into more detail about the farm later. We operate a youth program called the Food Warriors Youth Development Program. And this summer, we have a second youth program for teenagers called Food and Flavor. And again, we'll go into more detail later. And then the big project that we're working on now is the Detroit Food Commons. We're building a new 31,000 square foot, 2-story building on the southeast corner of Woodward and Euclid, the cornerstone of which will be the Detroit People's Food Co-op, a cooperatively owned, community-owned grocery store. I also play music. I compose and perform music and lead a band called Molly Wop. I play guitar. I play guitar since 1971, I think. I heard Jimi Hendrix when I was in the 8th grade, and my life hasn't been the same since. So, the creative part is an important part of what I do as well. And I'm a parent and a grandparent and a community member. And I suppose more and more people are seeing me as an elder in the community. And so I'm beginning to see myself as that and really grapple with the responsibilities that go along with that.
And it's interesting because you're multifaceted, and you talk about how your spiritual awareness and your creativity fuels so much of what you do, that people in other circles really know you, what they know you for. You've touched a bit about what you do. Who do you do it for?
Well, that's a complex question too, because on a certain level, even when I'm doing community service work or serving as a servant leader, there's still I guess, some selfish motivation in it, that I know that, again, my spiritual destiny is tied to the whatever good works I can do while I'm on the earth. So on a certain level, I'm doing it for my own spiritual, evolution and spiritual destiny. You do right because it's the right thing to do, not because you're trying to impress other people or whatever. So I do it for that. But then also I do it for Black people because, I'm very concerned about helping to extract us from this despicable situation that we find ourselves in, where we are disrespected, victims of violence, often at the hands of the police. We are the recipients of great disparities in the economy, and really great disparities in every system within American society because of the degree to which white supremacy is built into the systems in American society. So I unapologetically am living my life to contribute to the advancement and the self-determination and the sovereignty of people of African descent around the world. But I also understand that we do that within the context of uplifting humanity. African people don't live in a bubble. We live on the planet with everybody else. And there are common concerns that we all need to address, such as the climate chaos that the planet is in, that affects people of every so-called race. So I am for cooperation with all of humanity who wants to bring about justice and equity, but I am also unapologetically dedicated to the upliftment of people we call Black people in this country.
Last week, or earlier in the series, for those who didn't see it, Dwan Dandridge spoke about you being an inspiration, and he is the co-founder, one of the founders of Black Leaders Detroit, and he takes a similar stance. And I imagine that has a lot to do with your influence, that he's unapologetic about being a leader for Black people in Detroit. It seemed like prior to George Floyd, if you use the words white supremacy, or if you spoke to specifically the needs of Black people, that made whatever you were doing, infinitely more difficult.
Yes, absolutely.
And it seems that only since George Floyd can we use these terms that, add these words to the lexicon without people feeling like they're being backed into a corner, without you being made to be a pariah or feel like you're being exclusive. And so when you talk about the whole of humanity, it seems that we can now have that conversation. I just want to get your thoughts on that, or your perspective.
I agree with your analysis. And I've been using this terminology for many years without regard for what people thought about it one way or the other, frankly.
Yes, I know.
And often it was met with resistance and what have you. So I totally agree. I think the consciousness of society has evolved as a result of the relentless struggle led by Black people for our full human dignity. And a lot of that, manifested in the protest after the police murder of George Floyd, where people around the world were really mobilized against the disparities in the criminal justice system in the United States, the racially based disparities. So yes, the discussion is more commonplace now. When I was in college in the 1970s, I went to Eastern Michigan University, and I remember seeing in the student union a sign that said the radical thought of the 1960s has become the common sense of the 1970s. And so similarly, while 10 years ago, using terms like the system of white supremacy and white privilege and white fragility might have seemed like really radical terms, and people who use those terms were marginalized, now, as you mentioned, that is in the mainstream lexicon, and society has caught up to some degree, and at least is willing to engage in some degree of discussion. Even most of the discussion still is very lightweight, though, frankly. I don't think people are really willing to grapple with the depths of the system of white supremacy and how deeply it affects all of the systems in American society, but also how deeply it affects us as individuals, because all of us would like to think of ourselves as good human beings. And sometimes in our quest to think of ourselves as good human beings, we negate the factors that these huge societal trends have on the formation of our thinking about who we are and who others are. So we're all impacted by the system of white supremacy. Certainly people who are defined or who define themselves as white in this society are tremendously adversely impacted by a system that suggests to them that everything of value that has been done for humanity in the world has been done by people who are said to be white. And it also underdevelops white people because it suggests to them that their cultural experience and their knowledge of the world is sufficient, and they really don't have to have an understanding of the rich cultural traditions of Black people and people of color throughout the world. And certainly if you are a Black person or a person of color, we internalize concepts related to the system of white supremacy that suggest to us that we are inferior, that we are incapable, and that somehow white people and others, unlike ourselves, should have some monopoly on running the world.
You've been on this fight a long time. And that's why I think it's important to bring you into this platform so people can get the unfiltered perspective, and also to see the value in it for broader society. That is not an exclusive thing. As you said, we don't live in a vacuum. If COVID taught us nothing, we are all interconnected. As you may know, we did an art film honoring the ancestor now, Baba Charles McGee. And in it, we talked about how sand in the Sahara Desert gets caught up in dust storms, travels across the Atlantic and lands in the Amazon rainforest, and it's rich in phosphorus. And this is what feeds the ecological diversity. So if a grain of sand from the Sahara is feeding the Amazon, for us to think we're anything less than interdependent would just, be foolish. And I think that's why.
One of the things, if I can say this about the system of white supremacy, again, it minimizes the cultural experience and the knowledge that grows out of the cultural experience of people who are not considered to be white. So for example, you can go all the way through American public education from pre-kindergarten to the postdoctoral level and never have to study anything about the history of people of African descent, or never have to study anything about the history of people who are indigenous to the so-called Western Hemisphere. Those histories have been invisibilized, and the history and culture of people from Western Europe has been centered. Now, this is the problem. There's multiple problems with that, but one of the problems with that is that in order to center the experience and cultural knowledge of people from Western Europe, you have to suppress the experience and cultural knowledge of everybody else. But within those cultural experiences and the knowledge, the wisdom that grows out of those cultural experiences is the very wisdom to solve many of the problems that humanity is facing today. For example, many of the problems with climate are rooted in us not being in right relationship with the earth. But we have all kinds of examples in indigenous cultures throughout the world of how people have been historically in right relationship with the earth. But because the system of white supremacy suppresses those cultures and the cultural knowledge, we all are operating at a deficit because we don't have access to that knowledge. So the system of white supremacy underdevelops everybody.
So we've gone through what you do, who you do it for. I think you've given another perspective on why you do it. That's multi-layered. Let's talk a little bit about how do you do it? How do you do what you do?
Mm-hmm. So the main work, again, I do is to lead the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, a community-based organization. We're kind of a hybrid. Most nonprofits, they get grants and have a staff, and we have that too, but we also have about 90 members. So we want to keep our roots in the community, and the organization is really structured so that the membership makes the major decisions, like they elect the board of directors and what have you. So it's not a top-heavy organization. So as I mentioned, we do several things, and I'll go into a bit more detail right now. We have a farm, a 7-acre farm, D-Town farm, that we've operated in Rouge Park since 2008. In terms of how we do that, we have a farm manager. And in fact, I want to shout out her name, Sister Ayanfe Free, who moved to Detroit in April from Grand Rapids to accept the position as manager of D-Town Farm. And so she works full-time at the farm with our staff. We have 2 farmers who are full-time farmers. We have 2 farmers who work 28 hours per week. And And then we have one person who's a part-time person who's the farm maintenance and grounds manager. And so that crew meets regularly to plan out the work. In fact, weekly we meet to plan out what the next week of work is going to look like. And also we hold ourselves accountable, which is very important in terms of how you move work forward. If there's no accountability system, then you can find yourself circling the plane week after week after week without ever actually accomplishing the task. So having that accountability system in place is part of how we do what we do. And so those staff members work with community volunteers to grow food at the farm. The staff does tours for the farm to make people aware of the possibilities of urban agriculture. We have a farm stand every Saturday and Sunday where people can come and buy our produce. So similarly with the other programs, we have a structure where there's a kind of department head. For example, Mama Hanifa Ajuman is our education and outreach director, and she runs our 2 youth programs, the Food Warriors and Food and Flavor, and she has staff that work with her. So that's kind of how we do what we do. We've built an organization that is staffed with people who are kind of senior staff and then people who work under their direction and supervision. And then we mobilize community members to build Black food sovereignty with us.
There's been a lot of talk about food deserts in places like Detroit, but other places throughout the state. And as you mentioned, rural places where the population looks very different, but face similar challenges. Within this model, you mentioned selling produce. There's always an expectation, again, when you're serving the Black population, you do something in the city of Detroit, that it needs to be almost 100% charitable because the need is so great. I do know that you go out of your way to feed the community and feed those who otherwise would not get that sustenance. How do you balance the two? How do you create a for-profit model while standing in the gap to literally feed people who otherwise would go hungry?
Mm-hmm. Well, I first want to push back gently and lovingly against the use of the term food desert. That term has become popularized over the last 15 or 20 years or so. But many of us active in the food movement have stopped using it for a number of reasons. One is because a desert is really a rich ecosystem. It's not the kind of barren place that we think about. Secondly, food desert is a term that has been imposed on our community kind of from the outside in the same way that the term at-risk child is imposed on children in our community. I ran a school for 22 years. I never once had a parent come to me and say, this is my son Kwame, he's an at-risk child. That's simply not the way that we discuss our own situation. But the main reason that the term food desert is insufficient is that it doesn't really point to the intentionality of the disparities within the food system. Most people think of a desert as being a naturally occurring ecosystem. It's just something that happens. The disparities we see in the food system based on race and class are not something that just happen. They are by intentional design. And so many of us have begun using the word food apartheid to speak to the intentionality and the great disparities that we see within the food system. But your question on charity, so that's let me say this, that I think that gets at the main problem facing the food movement, or the main contradiction. And that is that we have to figure out, how do we provide food to everyone in society, regardless of their so-called race, religion, gender, sexual preference, geography? How do we make sure that everybody, just as a result of being a human being, has access to high quality food, while at the same time paying the people who work within the food system a fair, livable wage? Now, the problem with the charity model is that you can give food to people for the next 500 years. And, and I'm not criticizing people who do that, because I think people involved in emergency food have good intentions and good hearts and are sincerely trying to help people. But I just think that perhaps the analysis is not deep enough, because we can't solve hunger by simply throwing food at people, because the problem was not created because we have a lack of food. The problem of hunger exists because of the great disparities that exist within the economic system. And so we have to tie the struggle to eliminate poverty with the struggle for food sovereignty, so that people have enough money to pay the actual cost of food. Without paying the actual cost of food, then the workers within the food system will continue to be exploited. And so it's very difficult to meet both of those conditions, to make sure people have high quality food without giving it away, and with people realizing there's an economic value that is worth paying for, because it's that food that helps to sustain our lives.
We have an identical view about the lexicon, and I intentionally use the term food desert, because I said there's a lot of talk about a food desert. And these are these words we use: at risk, inner city, urban, underserved. And and we're talking to a lot of people who work in the mentor space. And quite honestly, a lot of the programs throughout the state use these terms to describe their program.
Right.
And I understand why. And I don't think all of them have ill will in using it. But until someone like you illuminates what that does, who would say yes? Who would be, as a parent, say, yes, I have my child in a program for at-risk youth or underserved youth or impoverished youth? Nobody would feel good about using that lexicon.
Right.
And that's where the artist in you and the creativity, language, how we speak to and about each other matters.
Yes.
And that is really important in this mentor space. The other reason, Baba, that I wanted you on, especially when we talk about food, food is the biggest impediment to learning for a lot of the population that our listeners or people who will see this serve.
Yes.
You know, we come up with these creative programs, but when the very basic needs are not met, it's very hard for children to learn and to innovate. And so it's long been my contention that when children are warm, when they feel safe, and when they're fed, a lot of times they innovate on their own. But how central for people in the mentor space, how central, how important is food if you seek to serve a community, and not just like a pizza party on Friday and kids coming because they get pizza and pop? How important is that for those in this mentor space?
I'll start by saying that food is so important that really agriculture is the beginning of civilization. That until human beings were able to begin to plant food and settle in one place and not spend almost all day chasing food, hunting, they couldn't begin to explore the wonders of the universe, develop philosophy, develop mathematics. That's how central food is. And so similarly today, food is still central to having a whole prosperous life. On the most basic level, if a child is hungry, they are certainly not going to be paying attention and absorbing information. But even if we get beyond hunger, even if the belly of the child is full, we have to be concerned about what the child's belly is full with. And I'll say this from, again, having run a school for 22 years, that if children are eating a diet which is which is high in processed sugars, processed refined sugars, the child may want to pay attention in school, but chemically cannot, because sugar is a stimulant, it's a drug. And so students who are trying to pay attention, both in terms of their mental focus, but also in terms of just controlling their bodies, often can't because they're hyped up on sugar. Similarly, many children have reactions to the preservatives and colorings in food. And, you know, as we had students who were diagnosed with ADHD and ADD, you know, and we began to study this, we found that all of these things contribute to these types of disorders. And so we should be concerned about not just making sure children have enough food, but that they're eating whole, clean diets that are free of artificial preservatives, artificial colorings, and are high in the kind of nutrients that allow our body, mind, and spirit to function at its fullest.
But we need a follow-up. We probably need a couple hours for a fireside chat. Well, we're winding down to the last few questions of this. And so you've touched on a few of them. What are your biggest challenges in doing what you do, serving the people that you serve? And I know that list, knowing you and knowing our history, our collective history as a people, I know that list could be very long. But in terms of how you operate,
I'm going to try to
in terms of how you operate as an organization, what are the central challenges that you face?
So I would divide this question into two kind of buckets. The first is external challenges. And those are ongoing. Those are challenges related to access to capital. There's challenges related to the disparities that are built into every level of the system based on race and who has access. Sometimes that's just even who has access to information or who has access to contact persons. So all of that is shaped to some degree by race and class. So there's those ongoing external contradictions. But there's also, and perhaps even more important, our own internal contradictions. As we are striving to be sane examples of what it means to be human beings, we are all unloading a lot of baggage, and we all are working through lots of trauma, and we all bring that to our organizational lives. And so that's why healing has to be part of the work, has to be a central part of the work, so that we can come to the work as whole human beings. Otherwise, we bring these challenges with us. And if you have an organization with multiple people and each person is bringing their own challenges, and you put that all together in a pot, you can wind up with quite a big mess. And so I would say that we have to be working on making ourselves whole at the same time that we're working to make the systems within society just and equitable.
And how did you arrive where you are? Again, I know this is an abbreviated question to some extent, but not just professionally, but personally. What shaped you? What led you to do the work that you're doing? You touched on at the top in terms of the recognition, your understanding of who you are as a spiritual being, but that could be a lifelong search that some people never come to that conclusion. So what are some key things that led you to where you are to do what you're doing now?
So I'm very happy to have grown up in the time period I grew up in. And so I was born in 1956 and grew up primarily in the 1960s in the city of Detroit. And in late 1960s, Detroit was a powder keg for Black radical consciousness. And that's the time period I came of age. So if I can point to one thing, it would be when I was 13 years old and I was sitting in my 8th grade social studies class, my teacher, Ronald McCombs, and his friend Melvin Peters, who taught another class, they would often combine their classes together. They played Malcolm X's Message to the Grassroots. And that influenced me on so many different levels. It put me on the path of wanting to dedicate my life to uplifting Black people. It put me on the path of wanting to study African and African-American history and culture. But also in that speech, he talked about what he called the field slave and the house slave, and the fact that the house slaves ate the food that was, as he said, high up on the hog, whereas the majority, the field slaves, ate those things that were cast off, like the hoof, the tail, the snout, and the guts. And he said, that's what you were then, a gut eater. And some of you are still gut eaters. The reason this had so much impact on me is as a 13-year-old, my very favorite food in the world was chitlins. And so Malcolm's speech made me think about my own life and my own dietary habits for the first time within a historical and a cultural context. And so that in a answering the question very broadly is what put me on the path. But also I've had many, many teachers and examples who I've gleaned from, and I consider it to be an honor and a sacred responsibility to continue to hold this torch of Black freedom.
I'm very glad we're having this chat, and I'm glad that you were able to make the time. And it's important that this perspective, which people rarely get, with someone as knowledgeable, but not only knowledgeable in the academic sense, has been your life's work. That concludes all of our questions. We have a couple of people here with us. I'm going to give you all an opportunity if there are any open questions for Malik Yakini before we close. I want to open that up if you want to come on camera and ask a question, or if you want to put something in the chat, not to pressure anybody. I'll give you a few seconds before we close.
And Mike, while they're doing that, maybe I could say if people want to contact me, they can go to the website of the Detroit Black Food Security Network, which is www.dbcfsn.org. dbcfsn.org.
I'm going to put that in the chat to everyone. That's D as in David, B as in boy, C like Charlie, F like Frank, S like Susan, N like Nancy.org, correct?
That's right.
All right. And then this will also go on a larger server where people can see this. I think we've covered a lot, And I think you provided some insight that we don't normally get on this type of platform. With that said, true to our form and true to my promise to you that we wouldn't take too much of your day. I know you have a busy day every day. Just want to say thank you personally, and also thank you on behalf of the Michigan Community Service Commission. And thank you for those of you who took the time to log in and listen. That is part of the dialogue of serving. I mean, part of the process of serving is dialogue. So thank you all for listening. And Baba, once again, thank you.
Thank you, Mike Ellison.
Thank you. It was interesting to hear your perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Margie. Thank you for sharing that. And with that said, we're gonna conclude. And this is the first of many conversations, but I have a feeling we'll be talking more about this. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everybody.